Today we'll be looking at two crucial reports published 100 years apart. The first, published in 1919, was the Ministry of Reconstruction's report, which effectively set the blueprint for adult education for the rest of the century. A permanent national necessity set the tone for adult learning as a key plank in rebuilding the country after the trauma of the First World War. As the title suggested, adult learning remains necessary right up until the present day. But as we know, as we often struggle, funding and the attention of policymakers hasn't always fully recognised this level of need. In the run-up to the centenary of the original report, a new commission was formed, chaired by Helen Ghosh, Master of Balliol College, Oxford, just as the original 1919 report had also been led by the then Master of Balliol. The commission brought together experts from across the education and related sectors, and again, the WA were proud to have been represented in the commission's report as well. In December 2019, the Commission published its final report, setting out 6 areas of focus and 18 key recommendations, based on a full analysis of how the history of adult education could inform the future. As the date of publication tells you, however, the report coincided almost exactly with the election of the Boris Johnson government, and then only a few months later, the arrival of the pandemic. So now, 5 years later, we feel it's a good time to reflect on whether the tumultuous period since its publication and now the arrival of a new Labour government changes the report's recommendations and what the future holds for adult education. I'm absolutely delighted that we're joined today by an esteemed panel with direct connections to the Commission, the 2019 one, not the 1919 one. Jonathan Michie, who was the Joint Secretary for the Commission and continues to hold the ring alongside John Holford on its legacy work, Dr. Sharon Clancy and Dr. Sue Pember, both members of the Commission, and we're also joined by Alex Stevenson, Deputy Director at the Learning and Work Institute, for the lead organisation for Lifelong Learning Week. I'll introduce each of the panellists in more detail as we proceed. Given their huge experience and expertise, though, I'm trying to keep these brief so I don't eat into their time, but it's a challenge. And we've asked each of the panellists to pick 2 recommendations from the 2019 report and speak about whether they feel they still hold up in 2024. Have they been achieved in the time since the report, and how much further do we need to go? Before we get into that, though, I'd like to introduce Jonathan Michie, Joint Secretary to the Commission, to give us an overview of the 2019 report and the recommendations it made. Jonathan is Professor of Innovation and Knowledge Exchange and President, Kellogg College at the University of Oxford. He is also an honorary Norham Fellow in the Department of Education and a member of the Department's Scope Research Centre. Before returning to Oxford in 2008, he was Dean of Birmingham Business School. Before that, he held the Sainsbury's Chair of Management at Birkbeck, University of London, where he's Head of School Management and Organisational Psychology. Jonathan became Chair of the Universities Association for Lifelong Learning in May 2020 and is a Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. He was awarded an OBE for his services to education and lifelong learning. Jonathan, over to you.
Great, thank you very much. Real pleasure to be here. I should, by way of introduction, just explain what Kellogg College is that I'm president of in Oxford. It is one of the University of Oxford's 39 colleges. It's graduate only. It's one of the 9 graduate only ones, and there's the reason it's graduate only, which I'll come to in a second, because most of our students at our college are studying for degrees at the University of Oxford on a part-time basis while they continue with other aspects of their lives. And I realize for most of you, you won't find that particularly interesting, unusual, or surprising, but for Oxford, that's still a pretty revolutionary concept. Up until my college was formed in 1990, you weren't actually allowed to study for a degree at Oxford on a part-time basis, and that remains true at undergraduate level, which is why my college is postgraduate only, because it's only in 1990 that the university agreed at postgraduate level people could study part-time. So they created a new college to support those students. So I'm very pleased and proud to be president of Oxford's Lifelong Learning College. It's often said that we live in at times of unprecedented crises at the moment, and the crises seem to be being added to on a daily basis or almost minute by minute at the moment. I mean, obviously there's the climate crisis, which is absolutely existential for human life on the planet. There was the COVID crisis, but there's a threat of future pandemics, which in future may be more deadly than COVID was. Clearly, there are military conflicts still, which many would threaten to escalate into Armageddon. There's increased inequalities of income, wealth, power, and geography. Democracy, I would have said democracy is under threat even before the news of coming from America today. Across the world, there's increasing threats to democracy. There's uncertainty about unregulated artificial intelligence, how that might be used or misused. I could go on, but perhaps as a result of all those, it's also said there's a mental health and well-being crisis, particularly amongst the young, who no doubt fear they may inherit all these crises. If there was ever a precedent, if it is not unprecedented, in this country, maybe it would have been the First World War, which was pretty devastating to society, to the economy, the huge numbers who lost their lives. One difference in that time, though, was the government of the day, led by Lloyd George, actually acknowledged the fact and established a Ministry for Reconstruction to consider how on earth a country, a society, an economy could rebuild after such devastation. And probably the most impactful thing that Ministry for Reconstruction did was create a subcommittee to look at education and adult education, which published its final report in November 1919, and argued that fundamentally the answer to the question of what was needed, how to reconstruct, at the center of that had to be education, and education for all, adult education and lifelong learning, education throughout people's lives. And it's interesting going back and looking at that 1919 report, as the Centenary Commission did, which the commissioners will tell you about it in a moment. But it's interesting because it was incredibly far-sighted in that the problems they identified, unfortunately, are still with us, and actually call for, show the need for adult education and lifelong learning as being, even if anything, even more important today. And firstly, they said at the time there was a need to broaden education to be more inclusive for women, working class men, all members of the community. And that point about access and widening participation, making sure that all members of our community are included, is as important, if not more so, than ever. Secondly, they said there were big national conversations that had to be had. No doubt they were thinking about the future threat of other future world wars, which, as I indicated, is a threat which unfortunately is still with us. And now we've got these compounded threats of the climate crisis, etc. And those national conversations have to include everybody. So you have to have education available to all, so that everyone can participate on equal terms. And that's as important as ever. And thirdly, interesting, they did recognize the need to deal with new technology. They said there were new technologies on the horizon, which is a reason you had to have adult education for everyone. And they made the point that because there were unknown technologies on the horizon, new industries emerging, it was inadequate at best just to train today's workers with today's skills. You have to have a workforce with capabilities and capacity to deal with new technologies they'd never seen before as they emerged. So you have to have a broad view of education. And finally, they said, because this was a time when the electorate was being extended, and this was their words, not mine in retrospect, that with everyone voting, it was vital that people were educated not just in the issues, but also to have the ability to think creatively, to weigh up evidence, and to distinguish between, on the one hand, genuine political argument from, on the other hand, demagoguery. And unfortunately, that need is as great today as ever. So I've used up my 6 minutes for now, but I'm delighted to be able to hand over to the commissioners who were actually on that Centenary Commission, reproducing what the original 1919 Commission did. Thank you.
Jonathan, thank you so much. I'd like to next. I'd like to invite Dr. Sue Pember to speak about 2 recommendations. The first is from the 2019 report, a statutory duty for local authorities, and the idea of a national publicity campaign to promote adult learning. A few words about Dr. Sue Pember. She is Policy Director at HOLEX, the professional body for adult education providers. Her role includes building up the evidence base on why lifelong learning is vital to the country's prosperity. Between 2000 and 2013, she was lead senior civil servant working with ministers on post-19 education and skills policies, including adult skills funding and workplace learning. Sue joined the civil service in 2000 to head up the new DFEE Skills for Life unit, and in response to the Lord Moser report, to create a new national strategy to improving adult literacy and numeracy skills. The strategy was successful, met its targets early, and went on to ensure that between 2001 and 2011, some 14 million people participated in adult literacy and numeracy activities, with over 8 million qualifications being achieved. Before joining the civil service, Sue successfully ran Canterbury College for 9 years, and before that was a local authority education officer. She started her career in teaching and believes that grounding still underpins everything she does. Sue.
Thanks, Chris. And I now feel really old when I listen back to that. But yeah, one of the things, in my background is that when I went into government to head up the literacy and maths unit, basic skills unit, people said to me, oh, people, adults don't want to do learning. They don't want to do maths. They don't want to do English. They don't want to, learn better skills. And in a way, those stats that you said, 14 million people actually went up a level. That's not just the ones who participate, that went up a level. So it does prove there's an appetite in this country for learning. However, that can't happen without the resources behind it. And part of the proposals put forward in 2019 was for more money. We haven't seen more money other than in apprenticeships. However, we haven't really had a massive cut either since 2011, and you have to hold on to certain things in life. So not having a cut is nearly as good as having a rise. So we have to think in those sorts of forms. But one of the recommendations back in 2019 was about local authorities and their role. Because I'm not sure how many people are aware, but we all assume that the money for adult skills comes from DFE or the old Educational Skills Funding Agency. But in reality, yes, the base funds comes from the Department for Education, but other government departments also put a lot of money into education, into skills. And I think the Local Government Association did a report last year to show that local authorities were managing often 10 to 20 different pots of funding that was going into skills. Now, a lot of those funding was for ESOL, for language training. However, many were going in for other things to do with the environment or with the Towns Fund, being very generalised for vulnerable families. So local authorities, whether it was designed or not, have now become like the anchor organisation for skills funding for government. Now, it would be great if, I think that if other government departments funneled all their money through DFE and it came as one pot out to local authorities, colleges, but that isn't the case. And what we found is local authorities are doing this work, but they haven't got a statutory role to do it. They didn't have in 2019, and probably it was a mistake in 2019. They should have been given a statutory role, not just a role. And we think, and this is something that HOLEX has been advocating now for the last couple of years, that the case for local authorities having a statutory role is stronger. Some of you might be aware that the previous government brought in local skills and improvement plans, and that was, led by the Chambers of Commerce or industry in the area, bringing people together. But those plans were tasked for level 3 and above. So nobody is looking at the adult, the post-19 adult who hasn't got a level 2 or below. We provide programs for them, but there isn't that joined upness, and that's what local authorities could do. So we still, lobbying that, local authorities should be given this formal role, not just be doing it. They should get recognition for doing it, and the funding should be more obvious and transparent. And then that also then comes to why we need a campaign. It's interesting, we have a campaign for apprenticeships. You turn on the television and you see lots of adverts for apprenticeships, fine. Although there isn't enough, vacancies, apprenticeship vacancies for all those who are interested now. But when you turn on the television, you don't see a reminder now, like we did in the early 2000s, about, you need to go and improve your literacy, you need to go improve your numeracy. Although we have had a little multiply project for the last couple of years, which has probably come into an end. And that promised us national advertising, but that hasn't happened. So people out there who have got a skills need to know about it, because they've still got an entitlement to adult literacy, adult numeracy, and now digital. They've got an offer of free courses. If they are on a low wage, they can get a level 2 vocational course free, but actually nobody knows. And that's the big issue that we have today, that we haven't done anything in that sort of marketing, advertising space really for the last 10 years. And we need to allow people to know. We need to know, future adult learners need to know what they're entitled to. And also we need to, I think, grab back the term lifelong learning. In the news in the last few days, we've heard, that the lifelong learning entitlement is going to continue maybe a year late. But that isn't an entitlement that I think anybody in this call would recognise. It's an entitlement to a loan at HE level. And again, if you look to the Scandinavian countries, when they talk about lifelong learning, they're talking about it from, cradle to grave. They're talking about young people. They're talking about, they 7 to 9 year olds understand that they're not going to give up learning at 16 or 18 or 21. This is something that they have to do for life. So again, when we're thinking about how do we advertise it or market it or subtly nudge people along, I think, have to grab back that term lifelong learning to mean what it meant in 1919 and what it meant in 2019 and what it means to most of us now. And it shouldn't be. I can't bear the thought that we're attaching an entitlement to a debt. So we need to actually rethink, and like I say, grab back that word lifelong learning. Thank you, Chris.
Excellent, thanks. So really clear and passionate, impassioned plea really for the role local authorities can play and how we do that. And I'll probably have a specific question for you if there aren't, if it doesn't come up from guests around how we might grab that back. Thanks, Sue. Next, Alex Stevenson from the Lifelong Learning Institute. He'll speak about the national lifelong learning strategy and aligned to that, the specific national strategy for essential skills. Alex is L&W's strategic lead on essential skills, overseeing policy and research in areas such as adult skills devolution, adult literacy and numeracy, ESOL and learning in communities. He leads L&W's international work and is currently an executive board member at the European Association of Education of Adults and an executive committee member at the European Basic Skills Network. At L&W, Alex has delivered policy research and advice to central government on essential skills policy and practice, and has led the national development projects. Before joining L&W, Alex taught, managed and developed adult basic skills and ESOL provision over 13 years, variously working in FE colleges, a local authority, adult education service, and for an independent training provider. Alex, you've done it all. Over to you.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks to you and colleagues at the WEA for putting on this webinar as part of Lifelong Learning Week. And as part of Lifelong Learning Week, we have launched the Adult Participation in Learning survey earlier this week, this year's survey. So I would absolutely endorse Sue's point just now that there is an appetite amongst adults to participate in learning, but and that survey shows that very clearly. But of course, we need to do more to focus on the disparities and the inequalities in that participation. Which takes us on to the recommendation that I'm going to talk about this morning, which was that the government should lead in developing a national adult education and lifelong learning strategy. I do think that that seems to be a really appropriate recommendation that still needs to be taken forward now, because we know that the adult education, lifelong learning and skills system at the national level is under-led, it's overmanaged, and it's missing a holistic focus. So Sue's outlined very neatly already some of the fragmentation around funding pots, and ESOL is a really good example of that. But also we've had a lot of chop and change in terms of ministers, in terms of organisations, sector bodies and institutions. We are concerned about the levels of investment. So whilst we know that individuals already invest more in their own learning than government and employers combined, there has been that overall reduction in government funding for lifelong learning of around about £1 billion or 20% since 2010. And there's been surprisingly little focus on increasing employer investment in skills. We know that employers are investing 26% less since 2005. And that employers in the UK invest much less than their counterparts in our European neighbours. And the final point around that is that there is limited integration of lifelong learning policy with wider policy on things like net zero and other really key policy priority areas looking ahead to the coming years and decades. And obviously now with the announcement of a post-16 education strategy and the plans for that and Skills England, there is an opportunity to develop a vision of what success would look like and to develop a plan to deliver it. So if you look around in Wales, for example, the new tertiary education body, MEDA, has set targets to increase the qualifications of adults by 2050. And the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in Wales also helps think about plans to reduce some of those inequalities in participation in learning. And we think that that post-16 strategy, the work of Skills England, should take an open and an outward-facing approach. Listening first, and why not include features like listening to the voice of adult learners and some learner panels in there? They do that really well in some other European countries. Ireland springs to mind, where they make extensive use of adult learner voice to help shape policies. And all of that needs to be kind of set out with some real powers and some legislation, which could include a duty focusing on the breadth and diversity of lifelong learning, and not just about deciding which provision is eligible for the skills and growth levy, but it should include oversight of skills devolution and ways of working with other government departments to increase employer investment in training. So there's lots of things there that we can hope for from Skills England. The other part of the recommendation that I'd like to focus on in terms of a national strategy is on the basic skills side of things. And I also agree here that that would be a really essential component of any kind of national strategy on lifelong learning. And it should build on the successes of Skills for Life. And we know that there are many successes associated with that programme, but also we should learn from the elements that were less effective as well and see what we can do in those spaces. But the current picture is we know that 9 million adults still have low literacy or numeracy skills. We'll get a new round of data from OECD in December, which will tell us whether that picture or not has changed in the past 10 years. But we know that participation has declined alongside reductions of funding by around 60% over the past decade. ESOL's doing a little bit better at the moment, but it's much fewer learners than under the sort of heyday of Skills for Life. So we do need a higher ambition on adult basic skills as part of a lifelong learning strategy. And I would like to see a bit of a focus on perhaps learners with lower level skills, engagement of underrepresented groups, and taking a holistic approach. The example in the Centenary Commission report of the Citizens Curriculum Pilot in Rochdale is a really good one, and more of that joining up of sort of health capability, financial capability, literacy, numeracy, I think would be really important in that space. So I will stop there, and thank you very much, Chris.
Thanks, Alex. I agree. I think Skills England is not necessarily unique, but a real opportunity and point in time to do a lot of this, to achieve a lot of this. And again, I'm sure there'll be a question around that as well. Okay, finally, I'd like to welcome Dr. Sharon Clancy, and she is going to look at the recommendations around the adult learning partnerships and the requirement for universities to provide adult education. Dr. Sharon Clancy is Associate Professor at the University of Nottingham, specialising in post-16 and adult education. Her writing focuses on class, culture and social justice issues through a psychosocial and historic lens. She was Head of Community Engagement at the University of Nottingham between 2007 and 2013. She is a voluntary sector leader. She was a voluntary sector leader, before entering academia, and she was CEO of Mansfield Council for Voluntary Services from 2000 to 2007. She is chair of the Raymond Williams Foundation, a commissioner for the Centenary Commission, co-chair of Scuteria, and co-editor of the Studies in the Education for Adults journal. She convenes, alongside Dr. Ian Jones, the Research Circle on Fostering Democracy, Debate and Dialogue, which emerged from the Centenary Commission. The Research Circle has led a series of 12 international events between 2021 and 2024, sharing research and practice in areas of social justice-orientated education, community and citizenship, and the role of imagination and creativity in fostering resources for hope. Sharon.
Thank you very much, Chris. Yeah, so the first recommendation that I said I'd speak to is around adult learning partnerships and the importance of a collaborative approach. In the original recommendation, we recommended bringing together local and regional government, universities and colleges, community and educational groups and local employers. We've seen, I think, the closest to that has been around the local skills improvement plans, which came out of the Skills for Jobs white paper. But I think the point I want to make about that is there's been a real lack of engagement from what I've read and my own research from what you might call street level policy actors, people, the educators themselves, the students, the local communities in the drawing up of these significant policy outcomes in local areas. And the whole emphasis on aligning with local needs seems to have taken a resolutely economic focus. Has been very much about how we can align ourselves more closely with employers rather than thinking about perhaps the broader needs of communities. Given that I live in Mansfield in North Nottinghamshire, which is one of the areas very hard affected by years of austerity and underinvestment, lack of real work opportunities in the area. This is something very close to my heart, passionately close to my heart. The importance of really listening, and I think Sue and Alex have both identified this, to community voices, and the importance of thinking about courses that align with people's broader needs. So not just about lifelong learning through the lens of the employer or labour power, if you like, and the economic imperative, but much more thinking about it in terms of indicators of local and learner needs, such as health, well-being, community participation, and essential skills around communication and critical thinking. And I think this links crucially to the kind of history of adult community learning, which was so powerful in terms of relating to local community organisations, the fostering of informal and non-formal learning at community level, in colleges, in a number of different institutions, including my own experience working for Councils for Voluntary Service, which were incredibly important providers of locally based, broad-based training at community level. So I think I just wanted to really emphasize the importance of community groups, local ownership. And I think we really do have to listen. We're receiving some very serious messages from people. Jonathan outlined them earlier about the impact of Brexit, people's disenfranchisement from political systems. And I think we need to think more carefully about whether that broad-based, community-based education needs to include a political element, thinking about Finnish models where people are encouraged to be able to think through issues around fake news and demagoguery and really bring those critical thinking skills to bear. So that's my kind of first point. The second is around the role of the university sector. And we said in our original recommendation that the regulator for the higher education sector should require any organisation that wishes to describe itself as a university to provide adult education and lifelong learning of types appropriate to their role in the local community, compensating for past disadvantages and utilising radical and engaged forms of education. There is no such compulsion on universities to do this. I think that's the first point to say. Many do try in different ways through widening participation programmes to engage and increase access for learners from disadvantaged backgrounds. But as we've seen and as we've heard today, there's been an enormous decline at university level over the last 10 or 15 years in terms of mature and part-time learners. These are the very people that we're talking about. I've seen myself over the last 6-7 years of working at University of Nottingham on the academic side, a significant decline in local learners generally. And I think we have to recognise that there's an increased focus on, given the precarity of higher education in the UK at the moment, on international students, and perhaps we're seeing less activity that engages directly with local learners and particularly mature and part-time learners. We've seen a huge breakdown of closure of continuing education departments, and this continues, it has to be said. There are still beacons of good practice, and I think I see that particularly in places like Glasgow University, which has an important programme, MA programme, which is around adult education for social justice, which I think is something that I feel deeply connected to academically and personally. So I think we have to really think about the wider roles of universities in their communities in responding to this, these needs for improvement in terms of genuine widening access, mindful of Sue's points. And I think it's fair to say that I wanted to say that I feel that access in higher education should really be centrally connected, should be a movement for social change, and should be much less about being a private good available in the market for those with the means. So we really need to reclaim something about the common good of university education as part of a broader emancipatory conception of adult education throughout life. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. There's definitely a few bits I'm keen to follow up in the Q&A. I'm sure there'll be questions as well. So that brings us to the end of the kind of panel piece, and we are opening for Q&A. I think, Chris, and Lauren, we're only doing the Q&A through the chat function, not raising hands. So please, if you do have questions, then please put them in the chat, and we can put them to the panel. I would note before that John Holford's done a shameless promotion for the forum journal in the chat, and highly recommend not only reading that, but clicking the link through to read that, and also seeing what that's going to cover a little bit more on that side. Whilst we wait for some questions to come in, I have a question for each of the panel as well that I'd love to put to you, and then obviously, like I said, we can circle back on any questions as they come in. If I may start, Jonathan, what do you think the biggest advance or improvement in adult education, lifelong learning, the country has seen since 1919? And what do you see as the biggest hope for the future?
That's a big question. I mean, if you're looking back, more than 100 years, then the key point was that the call from the 1919 report, was answered by WEA, by universities, and by others. And that in itself is interesting because the government itself did very little about it. The government didn't really respond positively to the report any more than they did with the Homes Fit for Heroes and all the other promises after the First World War. But despite that lack of government support or requirement, eventually pretty well every university took up the call and established a Department for Continuing Education or some such. I mean, the good news there is that, and that largely then put the pressure on government, which is funding higher education, to fund those aspects as well. And so for a time, there were sort of versions of what Sharon's been talking about, local educational partnerships between WA, universities, local authorities, and so on, which got government, national government funding and worked fairly well, certainly better than what we've got at the moment. I suppose the other highlight, and maybe this is where it sort of where it peaked in terms of success over that 100 or more years, was the formation of the Open University, which is obviously a great breakthrough and a great example, and still a great provider. The problem has been, the last 20, 30 years, where successive governments, for different reasons, I think sometimes willfully, maybe sometimes inadvertently, have done things to hamper the provision of education. And I think it's largely for the reasons Sharon's pinpointed about a too narrow focus on just the world of work, and within that, actually taking a very sort of blinkered view, more blinkered than they did in 1919, where they realized that, and they said, even with the world of work, you need people with, imagination, capabilities to be able to deal and make the most of new technologies as they emerge, rather than just being trained in today's skills. So I think there's a lot of positives to take from decades that followed that 1919 report, and it shows that we don't need to be stuck in the very narrow-minded rut we are now.
Thanks, Jonathan. And my next question is to you, Sue, and I kind of give you a heads up after your piece. So how might we grab back lifelong learning entitlement? And what I would append to that, the point not just about lifelong learning entitlement level 4 and above, but also the growth in casual learning and informal learning, and what I mean by that, non-AEB, non-ASF funded. How might the sector grab it back?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's the concept of lifelong learning, isn't it? So it's one of these subjects that needs to be brought in really to youngsters. So whether they're at junior school or primary school or secondary school, we need to get the concept, like they just said in the Scandinavian countries and like Singapore these days, that you're learning for life. Maybe we need a new term, but we need to get across the concept more, that you're not going to give up when you've done your GCSEs or your degree, that you have to retrain. And I think I heard something, what was it, through COVID actually, but one of the big 4 accountancy companies came up with this stats, which was like, if you were 19 in 2019, you would work until you were 79 and you would have 19 jobs. Yeah, lots of nines in there. But what they were getting across was that you need to be retrained. And all around the world, people, organisations, policymakers are looking about how do we get the middle age to retrain. And that's something that's going to hit this country quite soon. We do need to think, not just about AI, but, if you're going to have to work till you're 70 to get your pension or 79 to get your pension, you're going to have to retrain. So we do need to make sure that concept, it comes across to people, that you don't just go to school or university or learn a trade, you've got to keep on learning. And we got to be ready for when people are ready to listen. I think that's quite important. And then grabbing back the term, I'm just hoping that when this new government gets 18 months to think about it, they will realise that attaching an entitlement to a debt is not a good narrative, is not a good optic, and therefore they will drop the lifelong bit themselves and actually attach it more to, like Alex was talking about, a lifelong learning strategy. I think that would be the best way around it. And then on adults learning, I mean, we mustn't forget, although we have taken, a really big cut in funding in 2011-12, we still are having, over, 500,000 adults learning in their community, through their local authority, another 600,000 for colleges. So, and they are doing more formal education. And the survey that Adult Learning and Work published, I think it was yesterday, does show that there are more people doing some form of learning, even though it might be informal, it might be online, it might be YouTube. But the problem we've got there is the middle classes. I don't know if you call it in those terms, Alex, but it's the middle classes who are doing this, who are self-motivated to learn something when they need to learn it. And therefore we got even a bigger divide with those who haven't got connectivity or other digital skills. But it's not because people don't want to learn, it's that we now need to get out to them in one form or another.
Excellent, thanks, Sue. And Alex, if I may, and I'll try and keep the question. Well, the question is brief. The questions are flooding in now, so the response could be quite brief as well. Would really help me. Although it's a difficult question. So, and you touched on Skills England. If you could see one thing included in Skills England that you haven't seen so far, what would it be?
Did you say one thing? Sorry, Chris.
Yeah, just one.
Yeah. one thing. Okay. I mean, I think it is partly that thing about having the vision, isn't it? And you know, and that needs to include kind of all facets of lifelong learning, adult education, skills, whatever we want to call it, and articulating how those different bits of the system fit together. So I'm certainly not seeing that at the moment, where it's talking about taking over a limited set of responsibilities from the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education, maybe having a role in the Skills and Growth Levy. It needs to be much broader than that. It needs to think about how do those different bits of the system support each other, in relation to all of the other priorities that the government has set around, and making those links between whether it's social care policy, net zero, construction and home building, but it needs to be joining the dots between those bits of policy and putting in place the skills policies and the learning policies that are going to enable the government to deliver on those priorities.
Great, thanks, Alex, and thanks for the shortness of the response as well. My final question, and I will go to the chat. So Sharon, again, very difficult to answer in the time, but how do we make the case for lifelong learning as a tool for greater social cohesion and protecting our democracy, particularly so given what we saw in the summer and the growth in populism in the right wing?
I think it's really important, Chris, and I think also I wanted to bring back to the role of universities. I mean, we've seen a pretty much an ongoing onslaught, particularly recently, on arts, humanities and social science subjects. And I think there's something absolutely vital about recognising the role of university education as something much broader, which must have a political element, must relate to the real world that we're all inhabiting, and seeing some kind of connection between research that's taking place, real engagement with communities that goes beyond these kind of civic statements, that's much more about genuine engagement and connection with real community concerns. I think that would have an enormous benefit, because people would then be able to articulate some of the real concerns around the rise of the far right. I myself was political education officer at one point in relation to Mansfield Labour Party, and there was a real appetite to talk about Brexit. And people had different perspectives on it, far more nuanced than were ever given credit for. So I think there is real community appetite for this conversation. And I think universities must play a role in that, simply must.
Thanks, Sharon. I'm going to open it up to questions from the chat. Looking at some of them, I think there might be more WEA focused, so I'm happy to kind of take those offline and we can respond to them. So I'll try and pick ones that I can attach to the wider conversation or directly relate to the wider conversation. The first, I suppose, then, and I'll just have it as an open question to the panel, is the Open University statistics seem to indicate a rise in distance learning. What, as a sector, do you think we can do more? And I suppose a little bit of context for the WEA. Through the pandemic, we were 100% online. It moved to 50-50. Last year, we were 70% in venue and 30% online, and we're expecting that to shrink again. So that's just our small corner of the world. We're seeing actually a demand for in-venue learning. So, but I just wondered, just putting out there, what role distance learning will continue to have within the lifelong learning sector. And if you want to raise a hand to respond, that'd be excellent. I can hand over. Yeah, Susan, Sue.
Yeah, I think it's got a role, definitely. But like WEA, more centres are finding people want to actually turn up and be there and meet, because I think most of us, many of us on the call are educationalists, and we know that, you know, online is a good way to impart information, but it's very difficult as a tutor to get that light bulb moment with a learner who suddenly grasps a new concept, which then you can carry on. So I can see that, you know, you talked about the WEA split. I can see that happening in most places, although online has a place, especially if you're in rural areas. But I don't think it replaces, you know, in-face teaching with a cohort of other people that you can learn and be part of.
Thanks, Sue. Phil, I can see your hand up, but we're trying to do everything through the chat. If we can just work through that, I'd appreciate it. The next question, again, I'll open it to the panel, is how can lifelong learning, how can the sector do more to promote the benefits of adult education on physical and mental health? I think we all understand that within the sector, but how can we get that message out there that it's not just about supporting people into work, it's the whole package of benefits that comes from lifelong learning? Yeah, Alex?
Yeah, I'm happy to have a go at that one. I think that's a really important point, and this also speaks to the kinds of joining up and the coordinating role of local authorities that we've been talking about in this webinar. So our work for the Greater London Authority on social prescribing to adult education shows that, you know, there are some examples of really good practice out there, but they are not kind of systematically woven throughout the system. And, you know, some of that again could be another place where some of that, you know, resourcing that's going into that could also support adult learning opportunities, but we need to kind of do it more systematically and join it up.
Brilliant, thanks, Alex. Next question is around promotion of lifelong learning. So is there potential an opportunity or even a responsibility for promotion of lifelong learning to adults in schools, particularly in areas of disadvantage?
Chris, if we think about family learning, that's one of the reasons that we do it in the adult world. So, you know, adult tutors are going in to work with parents, with children, so that the children can see, you know, that their adults are learning and often learning some of the same skills there. So I absolutely think there is, you know, there needs to be a bigger focus. And to be fair to DFE, they are running a project about adults and family learning and literacy and numeracy, and doing some research on that now. So I do think people are beginning, you know, are recognising that we need to do more so that our young people do see adults learning, and therefore they realise that this is something for them to do.
Thanks, Sue. And Sharon, this directly follows your piece, so I wonder if you'd be happy to pick up the response, and I might broaden it out a little bit. It's around not only the idea of competition to provide career training, but also maybe how we can take out some of the perceived or otherwise competition within the sector itself, you know, and value and the recognition of value between different parts of the tertiary education sector.
Yeah, I think this is a tough one, actually. I think in the university sector, it's at least a lot of that is to do with the competition culture that we're all experiencing in terms of accountability and performance within the university sector and elsewhere. I think that needs close examination. We're in a culture of performativity, and I think we need to think more widely about a much more humane response to local needs, as I've said already. I think without that, we can't move on as a sector within the university sector. We are at the moment in a crisis of competition.
Thanks, Sharon. And then the next one is kind of grouping the conversation and is as is always the case within the WA, there's a heated debate around, you know, a particular piece, which is pleasing to see, because we really want to, you know, to have that, you know, breadth of opinion, and it is boiling down back to the kind of balance between in-venue and online learning. So I suppose the broad question, well, we've kind of covered it. I think it's, I suppose the question, and maybe an open question, is how, for us, it's essentially driven by the needs of learners. Learners for us are voting with their feet, whether they want to attend online, or voting with a digital, voting with a digital feed to vote and to learn online, or vote with their actual feet to go to a venue. How much do you think the sector can guide that, or as a whole, do we need to be responsive to learners?
That's a really good one, Chris, right? Can we not do both? Can we not offer this hybrid that we've managed to get ourselves into a position of doing? I mean, you know, I'm running ourselves a development program, a CPD program for HOLEX at the moment. So these are senior leaders in local authorities, and we started it during COVID, and they were very happy to be online. And last year we went to hybrid, yeah, and this year we've been nagged already. Can we have more in person? And although, you know, that's only 25 people, 25 adults, I think that is where people are going. You know, people want to meet people now, and they do not, you know, this is brilliant this morning on a screen bringing us all together, but you know, it is quite hard work to learn off this type of you know, formula sort of vehicle. So I think we can balance it. And also we know that we can do local things like teaching literacy and numeracy really needs to be in person, especially at the very beginning. If you are pre-entry, you know, trying to learn something off a screen and you don't know the language is way too difficult. And also, you know, so you can do things locally, people will come. And if people want to pick up something, there are so many national organisations out there now doing something online. I think, you know, we've got to the point where we flooded the market with offer. So, you know, I must admit, I'm on the bring everybody back to the classroom side of the fence now, Chris. I think that's the way of the future, whether it be universities. I've got youngsters in my family who don't want to do anything more online. They were the COVID children. They want to be face on face with people in a classroom.
Thanks, Sue. You started saying both and then ended really stridently on it, just in venue, which reflects the conversation and the whole piece. Thanks, Sue. Okay, I've got time for one final question, and it's from John Holford. So I'll read it out and then I'll open the question out. So one concern John has is that the Skills England will continue even deepen the overemphasis of lifelong learning on work and job skills. He's interested to hear the panel's views on Alan Tuckett's suggestion regarding strengthening wider perspective on adult learning. See his earlier comment. So is that balance between, I suppose, and how do we make the case to government and different departments around the balance between what lifelong learning should be? Any takers for that question?
I mean, we have one battle, Chris, which is that last year government recognised that adult learning was more than just getting a skill for a job. And we've got this new concept called tailored learning, which means we can recognise all the wider benefits of learning. And that's in place, and we haven't heard anything from DfE to say that that's going to be overturned. But we now got to use that as a stepping stone into Skills England to say, you know, to Skills England, it's more than just a skill for a job. It's a skill for life that they've got to be interested in. And they also have to be interested in, as we've said several times, that people got to relearn. People are not going to learn a skill once. They've got to find new skills all the way through their career. My only problem with Skills England, we're all hoping it's going to be the panacea of everything. And when you read the scope of what, you know, what's going through the House at the moment to create it, it's quite a narrow body. And when you see where it stands in the pecking order in DfE, it's not going to be that body with weight across government that we hope it to be. I could be wrong, but at the moment, the way it's set up. So I do think we need to work with Skills England, but we also need to think of other ways to draw attention to what we want from lifelong learning.
Agree. Brilliant. Thanks, Sue. We'll draw it to a close there. Myself and the WA would really like to thank the panellists for their contributions, for the conversation, for answering the questions so thoroughly, the engaging level of the conversation on what is an absolutely critical sector, a critical report, mission and piece of work for us that can guide us as a nation through these very challenging and somewhat uncharted times. The WA, as you know, is absolutely committed to that through our work in communities and through education, training and assessment.